Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the NY Deterrence Center. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, co-founder and vice president for research at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. The NY Deterrence Center is a 501c3 organization ensuring a broader understanding of the nation's strategic nuclear deterrent and its ongoing modernization. Thank you for listening and welcome to the show. The views of the host and the guests are their own.
Welcome back to another exciting episode of NucleCast. Of course, I'm your host, Adam Lowther, and today, as with every episode, we have a great guest. Now, Bryan Bender is the Vice President for Communication Strategy at SMI, and he's also a contributor to Politico magazine. And Bryan, before you left Politico, you were the defense editor, correct? Isn't that what your position was right before you left?
Yeah, I was the Pentagon reporter for the Boston Globe for about 14 years, and then in 2015 became the defense editor at Politico, where I was for about 7 years, overseeing much of their national security coverage.
Now, a few months back, you wrote a great article, "The Dangerous and Frightening Disappearance of the Nuclear Expert." And it was sort of a broad article that looked across the spectrum of this thing we call the nuclear enterprise. And you looked at deterrence specifically and looked at who sort of the scope of the professionals in the deterrence realm, and compared back to, the early days of RAND, when you had, Schelling, and you had Wohlstetter, and you had all of these sort of intellectual greats. And essentially you and many of your, the folks that you interviewed agreed that the bench depth was pretty shallow. Can you talk about the article and sort of what conclusions you came to?
Yeah, so kind of this germinated kind of early in the summer, when I was getting excited to see the Oppenheimer movie that was, the big splash. I guess it came out in July. And, it had me thinking that, if you pay attention to the nuclear issues and the debates and the budget and the modernization program that we're engaged in, the threats that are out there from Russia, from China, in a big way now that I think we all would agree is pretty new. And then, of course, the rogue states and kind of the non-state actor threats. It was, I think it's obvious to those of us who pay attention that, wow, we live in a very different nuclear age than the beginning when Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project began, and, the atomic bomb was used to end World War II. And so I was doing a lot of thinking about how to present that sort of how to compare and contrast then and now in a way that, would be accessible to a more average reader who maybe doesn't pay attention as much as people like us do to what's been going on in the nuclear arena. So that was sort of how it started. And, it was interesting. Probably the main takeaway for me was that, if you talk to 10 nuclear experts, my joke is you probably get at least 10 answers on a particular question, maybe more, and often have very divergent views. There are those who are very hawkish, who believe that we need to enhance our nuclear deterrent in a major way. And then, of course, there's the arms control community that thinks that we're, making the same mistakes, creating this madness, so to speak, of more weapons and, in their view, more potential that we're going to use them. And so they want to reduce arsenals. They want to find ways to, negotiate new treaties, et cetera. So a lot of different views on the nuclear issue. But I think what was surprising to me is almost everyone agreed across the spectrum that we just don't have the brain power that we need to think about these very complex, very dangerous issues, especially at a time where we have a world that it's not just the U.S. and Russia, the former Soviet Union, that has these weapons that are large enough to destroy the world, or much of it. But you now have China with this breakout or build out I think as Stratcom likes to call it. And, that presents a whole different set of factors on how do you deter, not just one peer competitor, but two. And so that's kind of, that was kind of the widespread sort of agreement in talking to lots of experts across the spectrum, is that whether you're someone who believes we need more arms control treaties, or you're someone who believes that we need to be developing much more innovative ways to deter our enemies from using nuclear weapons, we really need to build a new generation of people that are smart about this stuff.
Yeah. And it seemed one of the sort of the big themes that you pulled at, the threads, was just this idea of how do you build one. And there seemed to be complaint from younger folks who perhaps may be interested that, hey, it's just not that easy to become a nuclear expert, to gain the experience. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, there was a lot of discussion about sort of the barriers to entry, so to speak, into the field. And you heard a lot about the government side. In other words, if I wanted to be, a nuclear deterrence expert, and I've, studied this in college, maybe have advanced degrees, it's really a pain in the butt to get through the process to get into the government if you wanted to work for DOD or the State Department or the Department of Energy. I think those agencies are aware of that, and they're trying to find some ways to make it easier to attract people. But, but I think that also raises the question of, like, what are the training grounds look like? In other words, what's the feeder system so that you have people that are actually qualified for these jobs? And I think that's also an issue that is of concern, which is that, there's a lot of threats out there. There's lots of things you could focus on if you're a national security practitioner, and that's the field that you want to go in. And I think there was a number of people I spoke to who said, nuclear issues just aren't as sexy anymore. I mean, it used to be sort of the sexiest thing. And it was interesting. I forget who it was who pointed out that, in the old days, if you were a national security person, by definition, you knew about nukes because you had to. You were trained, in your daily job, whatever that might be in the national security arena, whether it's in government or in the nonprofit world or in academia, et cetera, think tanks, you had to know about nuclear strategy, right? Because that was the big game in town. Then, of course, we had 30 years where, from the fall of the Berlin Wall to really, maybe the tail end of the first decade of the 21st century, where, people just didn't really focus on it. We thought the big threat had gone away. I mean, there was a tension on nuclear weapons after 9/11, but that was always in the context of, could a nuclear terrorist attack occur? Could Al-Qaeda in that case get nuclear material and cause havoc? But, the great power nuclear standoffs kind of had receded. So yeah, generally an agreement that we just don't have enough people going into this field, for maybe some just obvious reasons. Human nature, we focused on other things and we took our eye off the ball. But then even those that are in the field, especially young people, a lot of them will complain that, well, where do we go? How do we get jobs? And, and I think one last point on this, I think you have to think about the pathway in two different ways. I mean, there's going into the government as a practitioner, whether it's in the military or as a diplomat, or as a scientist, an engineer who's going to build these weapons, at the National Nuclear Security Administration or one of the national labs. But then, of course, there's this whole ecosystem of people that think about nuclear weapons, but in the academic, nonprofit sort of advocacy world. And obviously, they have a very different view of the utility of nuclear weapons. And, a lot of the people I heard from who were complaining that, there are people like, out there that want to do this work, but there aren't a lot of opportunities or a lot of pathways. A lot of those tended to be people that came from the perspective of, we don't need these things. We need to get rid of these things. How do we get rid of them? And, in some of my conversations with them, my rejoinder to that was, well, we still have them and we still have to manage them and we still have to operate them and we still have to develop strategies around them. And so it's nice and useful and probably quite important for people to think about how do we reduce our reliance on nuclear weapons? How do we get other countries to do the same? But we can't ignore the fact that we have a massive nuclear arsenal and some really bad guys do too. And so I'm not sure that a lot of those people that were complaining to me are necessarily the qualified people to go to Stratcom to figure out how to manage the nuclear enterprise. I mean, they want to get rid of it, a lot of them. So there's that tension too.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting if you think about, so for example, the recent Strategic Posture Commission report, that was 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats, and some folks who were pretty staunchly anti-nuclear. And they were able to, essentially they got the threat briefs. And then after they got the threat briefs, their positions changed. And so there was a sense of that, seeing how the world really works and what the threats actually are and what the capabilities are and what your adversaries are really doing, that had quite a bit of utility in helping to shape the way people saw things. And so I wonder, as I think about sort of opportunities in the nuclear world, and I spent most of my career either in uniform or as a Air Force civil servant, to me there was always plenty of opportunity. You had to be willing to take it. And it wasn't, I've seen a lot of and talked to young folks who say, well, I want to make nuclear policy. And it's like, well, I hate to, break it to you, but I appreciate that as a young person who just got out of graduate school, you want to make nuclear policy, but you're probably going to have to start at the bottom and then work your way up and then eventually become a graybeard. And then you get to make nuclear policy. Did you see sort of a willingness of people to say, okay, I recognize that there are existing pipelines into the system, but you're going to come in at the bottom. You're going to spend decades, working your way up. And, part of this, there's this saying, how long does it take to make a 30-year nuclear expert? 30 years. And it seems that there's this sort of desire to, skip the 30 years and just be, go to the top right away. As you talk to people and interviewed people, is there sort of a sense that, hey, I understand I'm going to start at the bottom, I'm going to work my way up. I may be in jobs I don't really want. I may have to go into, I'll serve in the military. And then, maybe once I've done that, then I can move into a civilian, just whatever that might look like, that they understand there's sacrifice involved and time. Or did you see young people that wanted something different that didn't require all of that?
Well, I mean, certainly, on the arms control side of the house, so the folks that primarily work outside of government, but not exclusively. I mean, there are obviously folks from the arms control community and the disarmament community that feed into a lot of government jobs over, and have over many decades, particularly at the State Department. Obviously, I think many of them are idealistic, and so they want to make change now. Like, why do we have to wait? We need to do this now. But more to your point, which is the folks that really do want to go into the government, maybe in the military, in the civil service, and really have an impact on shaping nuclear strategy, nuclear deterrence. I think there are certainly pathways, maybe not enough, but as you point out, those pathways are not quick. I mean, you have to pay your dues, right? And I think, maybe I'm sounding a little bit like a graybeard, but it's probably not completely different than a lot of other facets of society, which is I think the younger generation is sort of conditioned to, get what they want quickly and, we older people might say, well, it takes time to earn that. You have to prove that you're, capable of doing these things. You need some track record. I found this as a, career journalist who started out before the internet and, did a lot of shoe leather reporting, like literally got off my rear end and went and saw people and went to archives and went to libraries and searched public records and, got some exercise, didn't have everything at my fingertips. I used to be frustrated sometimes where young journalists would, and I was teaching at the time at Arizona State University, they seem to judge the measure of a journalism career by how many Twitter followers you have. Well, hey, they got 1 million followers. They must be a real deal. And I would always think, and sometimes I would say politely, well, your journalism career will be measured on what you produce, the investigative journalism you do, the writing you do, the reporting you do. I mean, that's what makes you a journalist. It's not that people think you're a journalist and therefore, click and follow you on social media. And so it's hard not to think that in this case, there's a similar sort of vein running through society, which is like, well, I got to spend 10 years in the Air Force first before I get a real job. Like, I don't want to do that. I want it now. So, that's a challenge much beyond kind of what we're talking about. But yeah, I think it's definitely there. People, they want to have their big job and they want it now, and they don't necessarily want to, earn it.
It's that time of the show where we have to take a quick break. But when we get back, I want to ask you, so most of our listeners they come from the nuclear enterprise, whether it's the Air Force, the civil service, the labs. And so we sort of, know our niche well. Could you, when we're back from the break, can you tell us a little bit more about sort of the aspirations of those whom you've interviewed who are from the more arms control community, and how do they see things? And as you talk to them about, what's needed in terms of deterrence expertise, what kinds of answers did you get? So you're listening to NucleCast, and we'll be right back.
The ANWA Deterrence Center and NucleCast team joins the Exchange Monitor in inviting you to the 16th Annual Nuclear Deterrence Summit, January 31st through February 2nd at the Westin, Washington, D.C. Go to our website at anwadeter.org to register and receive a 15% discount. We look forward to seeing you there.
And we're back, and we're talking to Bryan Bender, and we're talking about a great article he wrote in Politico magazine a few months back, where he sort of did a survey of the deterrence practitioner in the field in its current state. So I'd given you a question before the break. So can you clue us in as to what you saw and what you heard?
Well, I mean, I think the arms control community, it's no secret, is very concerned that the frameworks that existed throughout, much of the nuclear age have either frayed or in some cases collapsed. The guardrails, so to speak, to limit the biggest arsenals in the world, to ensure that the U.S. and Russia were as transparent as possible about what they were doing and why they were doing it, whether it was a new missile or some new nuclear technology. And they're pretty apoplectic that we now are entering sort of this Wild West where there really are not very many controls or internationally agreed rules of the road for how to operate and maintain these massive world-ending weapons in a way that reduces the chances of miscalculation, of escalation that leads to the unthinkable. And, I agree with them in many respects, because I think even if you believe strongly in our nuclear deterrent, think that it's the bedrock of our national security and has been for decades. I think for much of the Cold War, when we were in this standoff with the Soviet Union, as much as we were building up our arsenals and they were, and we were trying to sort of get advantage in, in some way over the other, as much as, elections turned on lots of rhetoric about missile gaps and, oh my God, the Russians are going to, destroy us if we don't get our act together. There was always a pretty vibrant group within the government and outside the government that was also advocating for arms control agreements. Yes, we hate the Russians and they hate us, but we acknowledge that these weapons are different. We need to talk about this stuff. Even Ronald Reagan. I mean, some could say Ronald Reagan was one of the most successful arms controllers we ever had in the White House. But at the same time, he was one of the biggest hawks who, increased the size of the military and, some could argue, oversaw a buildup that eventually bankrupted the Soviets. And so fast forward to today, I think we're modernizing our arsenal. Quite logically, it's very old. We're not doing a whole lot new. I mean, we're not building lots of new weapons. We're just basically replacing the arsenal that we had, right? I mean, it's a little fancier. It's a little sexier. It's a little stealthier in the case of the B-21 bomber, but it's really the same stuff, right? But then if you look on the other side of the ledger, you see that the Russians basically violated the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty. So eventually we backed out of it. They backed out of it. It's dead. The Open Skies Treaty, which wasn't really a nuclear treaty, but it was a sort of strategic agreement that you can fly over our country and spy on us, and we'll do it to yours, and we'll sort of let each other look a little bit behind the curtain. New START, which Biden did agree with Putin to renew, of course, and a couple days into his presidency for another 5 years. That's effectively dead. I mean, there haven't been reciprocal inspections of each side's nuclear arsenals in years now. Obviously, the war in Ukraine upended everything. And so the arms controllers look at that and they say the guardrails are gone, effectively, or if they're not, they're going to be, unless we can figure out a way to revive them. But of course, the elephant in that room is that, well, Ronald Reagan had a partner. Richard Nixon had a partner. Even Barack Obama, in some sense, when New START was first negotiated and ratified. Obama negotiated that or agreed with Putin at the time. It was a different Vladimir Putin, maybe. And so, it's hard to see. And when you ask this question, I think the arms controllers don't have a great answer, which is, well, how do we revive those guardrails? What are the building blocks to do it in a way that it actually is effective? Because if the Russians don't see the need to follow these treaties like they did in the INF Treaty, and the Chinese don't seem really interested at all, at least yet, in anything like that, how do you go about doing it? So the arms control people are quite concerned that, we are entering this very complicated entered this new chapter in the nuclear age where we have more nuclear powers, but we also have far less arms control going on, concurrently. And so they see that as kind of a perfect storm of danger, of miscalculation, of sort of sleepwalking into a nuclear conflict. And, you can't talk about any of this without mentioning that the Russians obviously have been talking in a very dangerous way. Now, whether they're really thinking about using nuclear weapons or that nuclear weapons could be an option in Ukraine, it's hard to know. Whether it's more just bluster, but I'm sure, Adam, you read reports about some of what their sort of nuclear enterprise is writing and thinking about in terms of strategy. They've clearly they've made no bones about how they think that the threshold for using or considering using nuclear weapons was always too high. Maybe it doesn't need to be that high. Maybe there are instances in a limited way that nuclear weapons could be used to achieve their aims. And that's pretty concerning to a lot of people, I think, that, that's a kind of talk that I don't think we heard a lot of back in the day.
So as we think through this idea of sort of the nuclear expert or somebody who does this for a living, what was it that the arms control folks, what did they want? Like what was their, like for somebody like me, I say, well, geez, I mean, I know how to be a nuclear deterrence guy. I mean, you either you join the military, you do these things, you get out, you get a PhD, or you start a career in the intelligence community, or you go get a PhD in physics and you go to a lab. There's all these ways to do it. But these other folks don't see that, in the same way. They don't see sort of, this is how your career starts and progresses in the same way. What do they see as this is how your career starts and progress? What does it look like?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that they know, to be honest with you, a lot of them. I mean, and when we say arms controllers, we have to be clear that there's obviously gradations of that. There are people who believe in arms control, but are also very cognizant that we need to have a nuclear arsenal right now, and we need the right people to be operating it and managing it and sustaining it and developing the strategies for how to avoid ever having to use it. But obviously, if we did, how would we use it? There are arms controllers that believe that. They also believe that we need to reduce these global levels of these arsenals. We need more transparency, more openness, more of a path to reducing reliance on nuclear weapons, not increasing reliance on it. And I think a lot of people would argue, whether conscious or not, the world is going in that direction where we're relying more on it, not less, at least than we did in the last couple of decades. Obviously arguable to say it's any more reliant, that we're any more reliant on it now than we were during the Cold War. But we're certainly reverting back to relying much more heavily on it. And so there are some in the arms control community that get that, we need to be doing what we're doing. We need to modernize our arsenal. But they also believe, like I was saying earlier, that we need to revive these guardrails somehow. We need to create some more mojo in the international community, in the diplomatic community, to try and keep the lid on this, so to speak. But then, of course, in the arms control community, there is a whole nother group that I think very deeply believes that, the pathway to that, the job that you're describing, to sort of be the decision maker or the policy maker, they have to completely make an end run around that process. They don't believe in that process. In fact, they would, a lot of them would say that process is part of the problem. The nuclear enterprise is so embedded in our sort of national security psyche, whether it's the money that goes to these weapons, the companies that benefit from it, the senators that want jobs in their states from it, that by going into the system, so to speak, I think a lot of arms controllers, particularly the younger generation, would say, we'll just be contributing to the system that we want to destroy. Like, why would we want to do that? So I think there's this element, and this has been bubbling around the arms control community for a number of years now, which is we can't trust the world's nuclear powers to do the right thing anymore. I mean, the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1970, all the declared nuclear powers, at least at the time, said, hey, the rest of the world, you guys shouldn't get these things. These are really bad. And we promise that we'll work towards getting rid of them. A lot of the arms controllers who know that history and really believe we need to find another path will say, well, you guys are full of it. You guys haven't done that. That's 50 years ago. What have you done to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons? And so they believe this group in the arms control community, and it might not even be right to say they're arms controllers, because that presumes that they understand treaties and they understand history. They're disarmament people. They want to, get rid of these things. And I think they think the way to do that is to build the grassroots support to do it. In other words, we need to build enough support among international publics and among nations that are not nuclear powers to browbeat the nuclear powers into waking up and getting some sanity. And, how do you do that? What's the pathway to do that? I have no idea. And I'm not sure they do either, other than to organize and be activists and raise the profile and vilify nuclear weapons and vilify any country that thinks that they're worth anything. So that's a very different. So when we talk about arms control, just like I said, we need to be careful who we're talking about. I think there's arms controllers who believe in treaties and understand the role of nuclear weapons, but then there's kind of the mostly younger generation of very active kind of believers in disarmament, like a nuclear-free world.
Yeah. Now, it's that time in the show where I bring out Bob, and as I rub my magic lamp, and Bob grants you 3 wishes, but only related to the topics we've been discussing.
Oh, darn. I was hoping it was 3, no limit.
No. Yeah. So our topic, you've given us, you wrote an extensive article on this challenge of, do we have the requisite, talent to do this kind of work? So you now get to make wishes. So what would wish number 1 be?
Well, this sort of sticking with not just the nuclear enterprise topic, but the topic of my article. I mean, one wish would be in just the realm of education. I mean, I think, every school student in America of a certain age, I don't think you want to start them too young, should have to watch the movie The Day After.
Yeah.
I watched that movie when it came out in 1984 or 5 or 6 or whatever it was. And the reason why I throw that out there is because I think there really is this complacency in society that we've lost, that nuclear weapons really matter. They're really important, and they're actually getting more and more important. And that would be my one wish, because I think if we don't have a younger generation that understands the stakes here, I mean, everything these days can be so theoretical. And, I think that movie shows you what's at stake if we don't take this seriously, if we don't have the right people managing this, whatever side you might come from. So that would be my first wish.
So let me ask you, in order to make that a reality, if I commit to becoming a social influencer on the nuclear topic, and I want to be more popular or more infamous than Andrew Tate. So that means I've got like millions of followers, on X or Twitter or whatever, and Instagram.
Well,
are you gonna help me make that happen? And
I would totally help you make that happen. Although if we could become, or you can become an influencer like that, I would say forget The Day After. If you have 1 million followers, let's create some short film that can fit on TikTok in 45 seconds that captures what I am talking about.
Okay. All right.
It obviously is more current and talks about the current situation as opposed to, the Cold War in the 1980s. So yeah, I'm totally game for that.
Okay. So that's wish number 1. We're going to solve that problem. How about wish number 2?
Wish number 2. This is a little bit of a joke, but not really. I just read the other day that the Sentinel, so the replacement ICBM for the Minuteman III, is apparently in breach of Nunn-McCurdy, which is this very esoteric law where, of course, it's costing gobs of money more than Northrop Grumman or the other contractors or the Pentagon ever told Congress. Big surprise there, right? We've seen this movie before. Nothing ever costs what they say it's going to cost. And I love the Air Force's statement on it, which was you could have cut and pasted it into every other major defense program in the course of history. We've never done anything this complicated before. It's a lot of new systems and a lot of integration and a lot of things that we're really, kind of reinventing. So therefore, these things are hard. They never cost what you think they're going to cost, which is what they always say. So my wish would be, in a very narrow sense, that they get that program right and they get it right in a way that doesn't, bankrupt other nuclear priorities, because the Minuteman IIIs are old, and they are the bedrock of our deterrent. And if you believe in a deterrent, and even if you believe that we should have more arms control treaties and we should reduce the level of these arsenals. We still need a replacement for them in Minuteman III, and we need it pretty damn soon. So that would be wish number 2, that they get it right and they don't, spend the whole bank on it.
Yeah. Now, wish number 3.
Wish number 3. I'm not calling for regime change here, but I am calling for some clearer heads, particularly in Moscow and Beijing. I mean, I say that because I really do fear that we live in a world that I think is more unpredictable, or getting more unpredictable. And I do worry that without the leaders of the biggest arsenals talking to each other and somehow divorcing this issue of nuclear weapons from everything else that we bicker about, which I think we did a decent job of doing during the Cold War. I think it's really important to get back to that. And so I would love President Xi and President Putin to wake up one morning and say, hey, we hate the Americans for all this stuff, but maybe we should sit down with them and have an honest discussion about how do we prevent a nuclear Armageddon, because, nobody's going to win that war, right? Even you don't believe, Adam Lothar, that we can win a nuclear war, right?
The costs are great, but, but you can certainly should plan to win that war. Because I would hold that deterrence is more stable when your adversary thinks you do plan to fight and win a nuclear war. That is true, and that gets to this whole idea of having people who are really smart and innovative, who can think about deterrence and what that means and how you implement it in a world that is very different. I mean, I guess you're right. I mean, if your enemy thinks you're crazy enough to think you can win, maybe that strengthens your deterrence. It probably does, right? If that enemy doesn't think they can win. Yeah. So, all right. Well, Bryan Bender, thanks for joining us on NucleCast to talk about your great article and, shed some light on, this sort of spectrum of arms control, disarmament community and what they're thinking. And, because that's something we really don't talk about that often. So thanks for adding that to the bin of knowledge. Yeah. And thanks to you, the listeners, for joining us on this episode of NucleCast, and we'll see you next time. Well, that was a good discussion with Bryan. Always enjoy talking to him. I first met Bryan. I wrote an article when he was at the Boston Globe. And so he published one of the first pieces I ever wrote. And so we've stayed in touch over the years, and he's always been sort of an even-handed, fair-minded, journalist to look at things. So it's interesting to hear what he says and just hear his take, because, he sort of works across both the arms control and disarmament community, talks to guys like me and probably some of you out there. And so to hear sort of what the state of play is and where everybody is, it's certainly an interesting take and a way to understand where the profession and where the lay of the land is. Hopefully you enjoyed it.
This has been a production of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Krumthal. Follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at NucleCast. Listen, follow, and review the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.